I started working the night shift as a security guard at Central High School in Kansas City, Missouri, in the winter of 2022. It wasn't my first security job, but it was my first time working alone in a building that size: 3 stories, 2 gymnasiums, an old auditorium, and a labyrinth of maintenance tunnels beneath it all. Central High is one of the oldest schools in the city, built in 1912 and expanded over the decades. I knew the job wouldn't be exciting, but I wasn't expecting anything strange either. My job was simple: walk the halls, check the cameras, make sure no one broke in. But from my first night, something felt off. I remember standing in the main hallway, the one with the old display cases filled with trophies and black and white photos of long-dead students. The lights in the school were on motion sensor system, meaning most of the building stayed dark unless I was nearby. Every few minutes, as I walked, the sensors would click and flood a section with harsh fluorescent light, then just as quickly plunge it back into darkness behind me. It created an eerie rhythm, like something was following me, just out of sight. At first, I told myself it was just the building settling, the way old schools creak and groan at night when the heating system kicks in. But then there were the noises. Footsteps in the hallways above me. Lockers slamming in the distance. And worst of all, the faint sound of children laughing, high-pitched, but distorted, like it was coming from an old recording. The first night, I wrote it all off as nerves. But by the third night, I started keeping a notebook. At 2:13 a.m., I heard what I thought was a person walking in the gym. The motion sensors should have lit up that entire area, but when I looked at the cameras, the screens were pitch black. I grabbed my flashlight and headed in. The gym smelled like old sweat and floor polish. The bleachers were pushed back, and in the dim light, I could see the lines of the basketball court stretching into the darkness. I stood still, listening. Then, the swinging rope in the corner moved. It was the kind of rope kids used to climb in PE, and it was swaying back and forth, slowly, as if someone had just let go of it. But I was alone. I backed out of the gym, locking the doors behind me. The cameras showed nothing, and by morning, I convinced myself it was a draft from the vents. But then, the motion sensors started going off in rooms where no one was. I'd be in the main office, checking my log, when suddenly, the hallway outside lit up in sequence, as if someone was walking toward me. But every time I checked, the hallway was empty. The school had underground tunnels, built decades ago for maintenance and storage. I avoided them as much as possible. There was only one entrance, a heavy steel door near the boiler room, and from my very first shift, I had a feeling that something was down there. The air was always stale, colder than the rest of the building. The cameras didn't cover the tunnels, and the motion sensors down there would flicker on and off at random, like something was moving just out of reach. On my 5th night, I found the first message. It was written on a chalkboard in room 306, an old science classroom that hadn't been used in years. I wasn't even supposed to check that room, it was permanently locked. But at 3 a.m., the alarm system flagged movement inside. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and there it was. "Don't go below." It was scrawled in white chalk, in letters too small and precise to be written by a kid. The dust from the chalk was fresh, meaning someone, or something, had just written it. I left the room and locked the door. When I checked again 2 hours later, the message was gone. That was the moment I realized that whatever was happening here wasn't just my imagination. And it wasn't going to stop. By the 6th night, I started dreading my shifts. It wasn't the loneliness, I was used to working alone, but the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see someone standing there. Every time I checked a classroom, I prepared for something to move. But worst of all, the tunnels under the school were growing more active. The maintenance tunnels beneath Central High were originally built for the boiler system but had been expanded over the decades. Some of the school staff told me they used to run between buildings before parts were sealed off in the early 2000s. The official blueprints showed only a few corridors and storage areas, but the janitor, Mr. Hill, told me that wasn't the whole story. "There's old rooms down there," he had said, leaning in close like he didn't want to be overheard. "Some of them walled off. Nobody knows why. Just stay out of the tunnels at night." I should have listened. At 1:42 a.m., I was in the cafeteria, reviewing the motion sensor logs when the alarm tripped again. Room 306. The same classroom where the chalk message had appeared. I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight, and walked to the 3rd floor. The hallway was silent, but when I reached room 306, the door was already open. I hadn't unlocked it. I swept my flashlight across the room. The old wooden desks sat untouched, their surfaces coated in dust, but the chalkboard was clean, no message this time. The only thing out of place was a single chair, placed in the center of the room, facing the door. It hadn't been there before. I stepped inside, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I didn't want to, but I checked the chair, half expecting to see something sitting there. Nothing. Then, from somewhere deep below the floor, I heard it. A knock. I froze. It came again, a dull, echoing thud. Then another. Slow. Steady. Coming from below me. The tunnels. I turned and walked out fast, locking the door behind me. Back in the security office, I checked the blueprints again. The tunnels ran directly below room 306, but there weren't supposed to be any open rooms beneath that part of the school. It was just concrete foundation and pipes. But someone, or something, was down there. At 3:10 a.m., the alarm tripped again. This time, it wasn't room 306. It was the tunnel entrance in the boiler room. I stared at the screen. That door was always locked. There were no cameras inside the tunnels, only a single camera pointed at the entrance. The feed flickered, staticky for just a second. When it cleared, the steel door was open. I reached for my radio, about to call Mr. Hill, when I saw something that made my stomach drop. The motion sensors in the tunnels were activating. Not in one spot. All of them. A wave of motion, moving through the underground corridors, heading toward the stairs. Coming up. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys, ran out of the office, and booked it to the boiler room. The heavy door stood wide open, the darkness beyond swallowing my flashlight beam. I felt a chill roll over me, a thick, pressing cold, like stepping into an old crypt. Then, from deep inside, I heard footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming up the stairs. I slammed the door shut and twisted the lock just as something heavy hit the other side. For the next hour, I sat in the office, staring at the tunnel camera feed. The door stayed shut, but the motion sensors kept flickering, something was still moving down there. By 4:30 a.m., the sensors finally went dark. I waited until dawn before checking the boiler room. The door was still locked. Nothing had come through. But when I finally worked up the nerve to unlock it, I saw something new. Just inside the doorway, drawn in the dust-covered floor, were 2 words. Help me. By the time the sun came up, I was exhausted, but I wasn't ready to go home. I sat in the security office, staring at the boiler room camera feed, watching that door like it might open on its own. The words in the dust, help me, kept replaying in my head. Who wrote it? More importantly, was it meant for me? The message hadn't been there the night before, and I had locked the door myself. If someone had gone down into the tunnels after me, I would have seen them. That meant whatever left that message had been inside the tunnels the whole time, waiting. I spent most of the morning debating whether to tell Mr. Hill. He'd worked at Central High for over 20 years, longer than anyone else, and if there was some explanation for all this, he'd know it. But when he came in at 7 a.m., whistling like it was just another day, I hesitated. Maybe I didn't want to hear whatever answer he had. Maybe I already knew it wouldn't be something I wanted to hear. Instead, I stuck to my routine. Went home. Slept. Came back. But that night, as I stepped inside the school and heard the doors lock behind me, something felt different. The air was heavy, like the school itself was waiting for something to happen. I checked the motion sensors, nothing yet. But I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. By 1:50 a.m., I was making my usual rounds when the first alarm tripped. Not room 306 this time. Not the tunnels. The library. I froze when I saw the location. Unlike the classrooms, the library didn't have motion-activated lights. It stayed pitch dark unless someone flipped the switch. That meant if anything moved in there, I'd have to go in blind. I made my way through the halls, my flashlight in one hand, keys in the other. The library doors were closed, but I could feel something on the other side. A presence. A weight. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The light from the hallway barely reached the rows of bookshelves. My flashlight beam swept across the old wooden tables, the checkout desk, and the massive portrait of the school's first principal hanging on the back wall. Everything was still. Then I heard it. A faint whispering. Not words. Just a soft, rustling sound, like someone breathing against the spines of the books. I turned toward the sound. One of the rolling ladders was moving. Slowly. Gently. As if someone was climbing it. I raised my flashlight. No one was there. I took a step closer, my pulse pounding in my ears. That's when I noticed something out of place. A single book, pulled out from the shelf, its cover facing me. It was an old yearbook. 1923. I hesitated, then reached for it. The book was warm, like someone had been holding it just moments before. I flipped it open. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with faded black and white photos of students in stiff suits and old-fashioned dresses. Nothing unusual. But when I reached the final page, I stopped cold. Someone had circled one of the faces. A boy. Maybe 17, dressed in an old suit with his hair neatly combed. Beneath his photo, the name had been scratched out. But below that, written in ink so dark it looked fresh, was a message. He's still here. My flashlight flickered. Something creaked behind me. I spun around. The ladder had stopped moving. The whispering had stopped. But the air in the room felt charged, like something was still watching me. I slammed the book shut and left, locking the library behind me. Back in the security office, I checked the motion sensor logs. The library had never tripped. According to the system, I had just walked into an empty room. I didn't sleep when I got home that morning. Instead, I started researching. I pulled up old newspaper archives, searched through historical records, anything I could find about Central High in the 1920s. And then, buried in an article from 1923, I found something. A student disappearance. His name was James Wright, a senior who had been at Central High for only a year before he vanished without a trace. The article said he had been a quiet kid, mostly kept to himself. The school assumed he had run away, but his parents swore that wasn't true. His last known whereabouts? Inside the school. And the last place he was seen? The basement. The tunnels. My stomach dropped. James Wright had never been found. And I had a feeling I knew where his body was. I spent the entire next day thinking about James Wright. A student who had walked into Central High one night in 1923 and never walked out. There was no official cause, no police report, nothing beyond a single article buried in the archives. It didn't make sense. People don't just vanish. Someone had to know what happened to him. Someone had to have seen something. But if that were true, why had his case been erased? Why did the yearbook scratch out his name, as if trying to erase the memory of him completely? And more importantly, why was his presence still here? When I arrived for my shift that night, I made a plan. I was going into the tunnels. Every instinct told me to stay out, to leave this alone, to keep my head down and pretend it was all just a trick of my imagination. But I couldn't. Not after the chalk message in room 306. Not after the library book. And definitely not after what I had just learned about James Wright. I waited until past 2 a.m., until I knew the school was at its absolute stillest. I checked the cameras one last time. Everything looked quiet. Then I grabbed my flashlight, my keyring, and the maintenance master key. The boiler room was just as I left it, door locked, security light flickering slightly overhead. I hesitated before unlocking the tunnel entrance. The metal felt colder than it should under my fingers. I turned the key, pulled the door open, and stepped inside. The tunnels smelled old, like damp concrete and rusting pipes. My flashlight beam bounced off dusty maintenance signs, old metal storage lockers, and faded graffiti left by students who had snuck down here decades ago. The ground beneath me was uneven, sections of it cracked from years of neglect. I had seen the official blueprints of these tunnels, but something already felt wrong. There were too many corridors, too many paths leading in different directions. According to records, most of these were supposed to have been sealed off years ago. So why were some still open? I moved deeper, the sound of my own footsteps too loud in the dead silence. I passed an old wooden door marked electrical, the paint peeling. A few steps later, another door, this one without a label. I reached for the handle, heart pounding, and twisted. Locked. But there were scratches near the keyhole, deep gouges in the wood, as if someone had tried to claw their way inside, or maybe out. That's when I heard the knock. A dull, slow thud, coming from deeper in the tunnels. I froze. It came again. 1, 2, 3. Rhythmic, steady, as if someone was knocking on an invisible door. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't the pipes. It was deliberate. I should have turned around. I should have walked back to the boiler room, locked the door, and never come back. But I didn't. Instead, I did something stupid. I knocked back. The moment my knuckles rapped against the concrete wall, the tunnel lights flickered. Not just one light. All of them. A long, slow flicker, like the entire underground had blinked. The air shifted, a sudden drop in temperature, and then, footsteps. They weren't loud, but they were close. Not shuffling. Not dragging. Just a soft, steady patter. Coming from somewhere in the dark ahead of me. I lifted my flashlight. For a split second, I saw it. A shadow, long and thin, just beyond the reach of my light. It didn't move like a person. It moved like something that had forgotten how to walk. I backed up, moving quickly but carefully, my boots crunching against the loose gravel of the floor. My breath felt too loud, my pulse hammering in my ears. The tunnel seemed to stretch longer, as if the distance between me and the exit had doubled. The footsteps behind me quickened. I turned and ran. The air was thick, pressing against me as I sprinted toward the boiler room door. I could hear the footsteps keeping pace, impossibly fast, impossibly close. The lights flickered again, this time for longer, plunging the tunnel into near total darkness. I fumbled for my key as I reached the door, jammed it into the lock, and threw myself into the boiler room just as something slammed into the other side. I locked it. I stood there, gasping for breath, listening. Silence. But I wasn't stupid. I knew something was still there, just beyond the door, waiting. Then, finally, it came. A whisper, so faint I almost didn't hear it. Let me out. I stumbled backward. The door didn't shake. The lock didn't rattle. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that something was still standing on the other side. Watching. Listening. Waiting. I left the school the moment my shift ended. I didn't even bother filing a report. I didn't care if the principal wanted an explanation about why the boiler room door had been scratched deep with fingernail marks by morning. That wasn't my problem anymore. But as I drove home, gripping the wheel with white knuckles, I couldn't stop thinking about it. If James Wright vanished in 1923, and his name had been erased from the school's records, then who had scratched that name out? And more importantly, who had been trying to get out ever since? I didn't go straight home. I told myself I needed time to clear my head, but the truth was, I didn't want to be alone. I drove around Kansas City, watching the streetlights flicker past, the empty roads stretching into the night. The whole time, my hands gripped the wheel tighter than they needed to. Every time I stopped at a red light, I felt like something was watching me. Every time I checked my mirrors, I half expected to see a figure sitting in my back seat. By the time I pulled into my apartment parking lot, the sky was beginning to lighten. I got out, locked the doors, double-checked them, and stood there for a long moment, staring at the dark windows of my building. I lived on the third floor, and yet I had the overwhelming feeling that if I looked up, I'd see someone standing at my window, looking down at me. I forced myself inside. I locked my door, pulled the blinds shut, and collapsed onto my couch. I was done with that school. I had made up my mind. I wasn't going back. The job wasn't worth it. But then, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I stared at the screen. I knew better than to answer, but something in me, some awful, gnawing curiosity, forced my hand. I picked up. I didn't speak, just held the phone to my ear, waiting. At first, there was only silence. Then, so faint I almost thought I imagined it, a voice. Help me. It was a whisper, almost static. The same voice I had heard from the other side of the boiler room door. I hung up so fast my fingers fumbled against the screen. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared at the phone. The call log showed nothing. No missed call. No incoming number. I turned my phone off and threw it across the room. I spent the entire day in a state of exhaustion, too tired to move but too afraid to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the tunnel stretching before me, the flickering lights, the shadow moving just outside my flashlight beam. I knew I wasn't going back. Not for my paycheck. Not for an explanation. But at 5:30 p.m., as I sat in my apartment trying to convince myself I was done, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text. Mert Hill, you need to come back to the school. Now. I stared at the message, my stomach twisting into knots. I hadn't told anyone what happened last night, and I had been ready to quit without another word. But something about Hill's message, the bluntness, the urgency, told me this wasn't about my job. This was something else. I didn't respond. I let the minutes pass, waiting for him to say more. At 6 p.m., another message. Mert Hill, don't ignore this. Something's happened. I swallowed hard. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to turn off my phone and pretend none of this was real. But I had the overwhelming feeling that if I didn't go back, I'd regret it. So against my better judgment, I grabbed my jacket, got into my car, and drove back to Central High. The school was eerily quiet when I pulled into the back parking lot. It looked different in the early evening, its old brick walls catching the last of the daylight, but that didn't make it any less ominous. I found Mr. Hill waiting at the side entrance, arms crossed, his usual easygoing demeanor completely gone. His face looked pale, the deep lines in his forehead more pronounced. You took too long, he muttered, opening the door and motioning me inside. What's going on? I asked, keeping my voice low. He didn't answer immediately. He led me through the empty hallways, past the main office, past the library, his pace quick and unnaturally tense. When we finally stopped, I realized where we were. The boiler room. The door was unlocked. Hill pushed it open, stepping inside, his flashlight already in hand. I hesitated before following him in. And that's when I saw it. The boiler room door to the tunnels was open. The lock had been snapped clean off. Hill turned to me, his face grim. This wasn't like this when I left last night. I felt a chill creep down my spine. Who else has access to the keys? No one but me. And you. His eyes met mine. And I know you didn't do this. The air was cold, colder than it had any right to be. A metallic smell clung to the room, faint but distinct. It reminded me of rust. Or blood. The light from Hill's flashlight flickered as he stepped toward the open tunnel entrance. We have to check, he said, his voice tight. I wanted to tell him no. I wanted to turn around and leave. But something about the way he looked, his jaw clenched, his grip on the flashlight just a little too tight, told me that he already knew something bad had happened. We stepped inside. The tunnel stretched ahead, dark and waiting. My flashlight beam cut through the dust-choked air, landing on the same graffiti-covered walls and old maintenance doors I had seen the night before. Everything looked the same. But something felt different. The silence wasn't just empty, it was expectant. We moved carefully, deeper into the underground, the gravel crunching beneath our boots. I kept my eyes on the ground, my breath slow and steady. We passed the old electrical door, then the storage room with the scratched keyhole, and then Hill stopped abruptly. My stomach clenched as I followed his gaze. There was something ahead of us. At first, I thought it was a pile of rags or an old tarp someone had abandoned decades ago. But as we moved closer, my flashlight passed over it, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was a shoe, and inside it was a foot. The body was slumped against the wall, half hidden in the darkness, covered in decades of dust and decay. The remains were old, skeletal, the clothing hanging loose over brittle bones. But there was one thing that wasn't old. The fingernails. They were long, far too long, curling out from the ends of the decayed fingers. They had been scraping against the wall over and over again. I felt bile rise in my throat. That's when I saw what had been scratched into the stone. A single name. James Wright. Hill exhaled sharply. Jesus Christ. His flashlight flickered, his grip tightening. He was here this whole time. I swallowed hard, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. No. Not just here. Waiting. And now, the door had been opened. I wanted to believe it was over. That we had found James Wright, that the horror in the tunnels was nothing more than an old mystery finally solved. But as I stood there, staring at the decayed remains slumped against the tunnel wall, I knew, deep in my gut, that this was only the beginning. The air felt wrong. Thick. Pressing. Like the underground itself was breathing. Mr. Hill knelt next to the skeletal form, his flashlight shaking slightly in his grip. How the hell did nobody find him? His voice was hoarse, disbelief thick in every word. This school's been renovated, cleaned, worked on for decades. And yet, he was just sitting here? He reached out hesitantly, brushing dust from the fragments of old clothing, revealing a patch of faded fabric, a central high emblem, barely visible after a century of decay. I swallowed, forcing my voice steady. Because someone wanted him to stay hidden. Hill turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. I gestured toward the wall behind the corpse, my flashlight beam highlighting the name James Wright, etched so deep into the stone that the groove still looked fresh. But there was something else, something I hadn't noticed before. Below the name, scratched into the concrete with those long, curling fingernails, were 3 final words. I was not alone. My stomach twisted into knots. I didn't want to ask. I didn't want to know. But the words were there, buried in dust and time, waiting for someone to read them. I turned to Hill. We have to leave. Now. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face before nodding. Yeah, you're right. The tunnel lights flickered. Both of us froze. A deep, bone-chilling creak echoed through the underground. It wasn't coming from behind us. It wasn't coming from the entrance. It was coming from deeper in the tunnels. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The air shifted, that familiar heavy cold washing over me. It was the same sensation I had felt before, back in the boiler room, when something had whispered through the door. I turned my flashlight toward the darkness ahead, scanning the corridor, looking for anything, any sign of movement. And then, I saw it. Footprints. Not old, dust-covered prints from long-dead maintenance workers. Not rat tracks or debris shifting from the draft. Fresh footprints. Leading away from James Wright's body. And they weren't ours. I turned to Hill, my voice barely a whisper. We are not alone down here. His expression shifted, the realization sinking in. He grabbed my arm, his grip unsteady but strong. We're leaving. Right now. We turned back toward the boiler room entrance, moving fast, our footsteps crunching against the gravel. But as we passed the old maintenance doors, something changed. The tunnel walls seemed to stretch, growing longer, the light at the end looking too far away. The air grew thicker, suffocating. It felt like walking through water, like something unseen was trying to hold us back. A sound rose from behind us. At first, it was just a soft rustling, like old fabric shifting in the dark. Then came footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the underground. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I could feel it behind me. We reached the boiler room door, Hill shoving it open with so much force that it slammed against the wall. We stumbled inside, the air suddenly warmer, the pressure lifting the moment we crossed the threshold. Hill spun, slamming the tunnel door shut and locking it. We both stood there, gasping for breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Silence. Nothing moved. The tunnel remained dark and still beyond the small window in the door. For the first time in what felt like hours, I let myself breathe. What the hell was that? Hill didn't answer right away. He just leaned against the door, his face pale. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, but there was something else beneath it. Fear. I don't know, he admitted. But I do know one thing. If James Wright wasn't alone down there when he died, then whoever was with him is still here. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. We left the school without another word. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the sound of whispering footsteps behind me, the flickering tunnel lights, the scraping of long nails against stone. Every time I blinked, I saw that final message, scratched into the wall, written by a dying boy who had spent his last moments trapped underground. I was not alone. And the worst part? Neither were we. I didn't go back to Central High the next night. Or the night after that. I told myself I was done, that I had seen enough, that whatever had been waiting in those tunnels could stay there. I ignored Mr. Hill's calls. I ignored the news reports about the discovery of a historical artifact beneath the school because that's how they framed it. Not human remains, not the tragic story of a missing boy finally found after a century, but a historical artifact, like he was nothing more than an exhibit. But deep down, I knew I couldn't just walk away. The feeling didn't go away. That sense of something unfinished, of something watching. Even in my apartment, I felt it. The weight of unseen eyes, the occasional flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. I told myself I was just paranoid, that I had spent too many nights inside that damn school, let the isolation get to me. Then, on the fourth night after we found James Wright's body, I woke up to my phone buzzing. It was an unknown number. I stared at it, pulse hammering, my mind already racing through possibilities. Maybe it was a robocall. Maybe it was a wrong number. Maybe, almost certainly, it was nothing at all. I almost let it ring out, almost ignored it like the last one. But something inside me, some deep, awful curiosity, forced my hand. I picked up. Silence. Then, the whisper. You left me there. I sat up so fast I nearly dropped the phone. My heart pounded against my ribs, breath coming in short gasps. My apartment was still dark, just the dull glow of the streetlights casting faint shadows on my walls. I swallowed, forcing my voice steady. Who is this? My throat was dry, the words barely leaving my mouth. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my hands shaking, then checked the call log, my stomach twisting as I scrolled. There was nothing. No missed call. No incoming number. No record that the conversation had even happened. I didn't sleep after that. I paced my apartment for hours, every sound outside making my nerves snap tight. Shadows felt sharper, the air in my own home heavier than it should have been. By 5 a.m., after hours of trying and failing to convince myself I had imagined the whole thing, I gave up. I grabbed my keys, my flashlight, and my jacket, and I drove. Back to Central High. The school was empty at this hour, no students, no staff, only the dim glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the parking lot. I sat in my car for a long moment before forcing myself out. The building loomed in front of me, just as it had every night before, but something about it felt different now. Heavier. Like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I let myself in with the spare key I still had, the hallway lights buzzing faintly overhead. My footsteps echoed, too loud in the silent corridors. I walked toward the boiler room, my muscles coiled tight, expecting something, anything, to happen. But before I reached it, something else made me stop. Room 306. The door was open. I hadn't been near it since the chalkboard message appeared, but now, standing in front of it, I felt that same unbearable pull. I stepped inside, my breath slow, the air impossibly still. The desks sat untouched, a thin layer of dust covering them. The chalkboard was blank. But then I saw it. On the far side of the room, one of the locker doors was open, just slightly ajar. I swallowed hard, took slow steps forward, and reached out. The hinges creaked as I pulled it open, the stale scent of dust and metal filling my nose. Inside, scrawled on the back wall of the locker, was a message. Not in chalk. In something darker. Not done. I staggered back, my stomach twisting, the air thick with the scent of rust. My pulse pounded in my ears. I turned to leave, forced my feet to move, when something stopped me. A sound. A voice. Low. Hollow. Right behind me. You have to see. The lights flickered. I bolted out of the room, my breath tearing out of me in ragged gasps, my pulse hammering like a drum. The hallway stretched too long in front of me, the school pressing in, closing around me, the air suffocating. I nearly stumbled as I reached the boiler room, my hands fumbling with the keys. The door was already unlocked. The tunnel door was open. I stood frozen at the threshold, staring into the darkness beyond. The air was cold, thick with the weight of something old and waiting. I could hear it down there, the faintest shuffling sound, the whisper of movement just beyond the reach of my light. I took a step forward, because I knew, no matter what was waiting down there, no matter how deep this went, I had to see it through. I had to know. And I had to face whatever was still inside those tunnels. The darkness in the tunnel wasn't just the absence of light, it felt deeper than that, heavier, like stepping into a place where time itself had stalled. My flashlight beam cut through the air in front of me, illuminating the cracked walls, the old maintenance doors, the gravel-strewn floor. The air was thick with dust and something else, something damp, like wet stone and rusting metal. I forced my feet forward, my breath slow, careful. Each step felt heavier than the last, like something in the tunnel was resisting me, pushing against me without touching me at all. As I moved deeper, I counted my steps, marking the path in my mind. The entrance was still behind me. I could turn back now, close the door, pretend I never stepped inside again. But I knew better. Whatever had started when we found James Wright's body wasn't over. Something had been waiting for too long, and now that the tunnel was open, I wasn't the only one inside. Ahead of me, the corridor stretched into the dark, the light from my flashlight struggling against the weight of the shadows. The tunnel should have felt colder the further I went, but instead, the air was thick, humid, like a storm waiting to break. Then, the noise started again. A soft shuffle, the sound of something moving just out of sight. Not footsteps exactly, something slower, like fabric dragging along the concrete. I swallowed hard, lifted the flashlight, and turned the corner. The door to the old electrical room was open. I knew it had been locked before. The first time I had come down here, I had checked. The metal had been rusted over, the hinges sealed with years of neglect. But now it hung slightly ajar, the dark space beyond waiting for me. My pulse slammed against my ribs, my grip tightening around the flashlight. I should have turned around. I should have closed the door and left. But instead, I reached out, placed my fingers against the cold metal, and pushed it open. The room inside was wrong. The air was stale, the scent of damp earth stronger, and the walls were lined with old fuse boxes and rusted panels, long since abandoned. But what made me freeze wasn't the equipment. It was what was on the far side of the room. A desk. And a chair. They shouldn't have been there. Everything else in the tunnel had been abandoned for decades, but this wasn't rusted or falling apart. The desk looked clean, the chair neatly tucked beneath it, as if someone had been sitting there just minutes before. My stomach twisted. This wasn't part of the school's old infrastructure. Someone had put it here. And then I saw the papers. Scattered across the desk, illuminated by my shaking flashlight beam, were old student records. Some were yellowed with time, others crisper, newer, but all bore the same name. James Wright. My breath hitched. I stepped closer, my fingers brushing over the pages, my eyes scanning the faded ink. Enrollment records. Behavior reports. Letters from faculty. They went back decades, long after James Wright had supposedly disappeared. But if he had vanished in 1923, why were there records of him dated as recently as 1965? I flipped through the papers, my pulse pounding, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I found the last document. A handwritten note in thick, uneven scrawl. Still here. Still waiting. Still watching. A sharp noise behind me made me whirl around, my flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. The door had swung shut. I sucked in a breath, stepping back, my heart beat a hammer against my ribs. The room was too silent, the air pressing in. Then, a whisper, right against my ear. You shouldn't be here. The light flickered. The air dropped. The shadows shifted. I ran. I slammed against the door, wrenching it open and sprinting down the corridor, my flashlight beam shaking wildly, my footsteps slamming against the ground. The tunnel stretched too long, the air growing thick, heavy, each breath like swallowing fog. The footsteps behind me weren't mine anymore. I didn't stop running until I burst into the boiler room, my body crashing against the desk, the flashlight tumbling from my grip. I scrambled up, turned back, expecting to see something, anything, burst through that door behind me. But there was nothing. The tunnel stood empty, the door hanging open, but the darkness inside it felt alive, like it was breathing. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the key from my belt, slammed the steel door shut, and locked it. For a long time, I just stood there, my breath ragged, my legs shaking. My body was still running on pure adrenaline, my mind racing through what I had just seen, what I had just heard. But one thought cut through it all. James Wright had never left Central High. And I wasn't the first one to come looking for him. I didn't go home. I couldn't. Not after what I had seen. Not after what I had heard. Instead, I sat in my car, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went numb, staring at the empty school building through the windshield. The security lights hummed faintly, casting long, skeletal shadows across the pavement. I kept telling myself to drive away, to forget about this place, to pretend that I hadn't just heard a voice whisper against my ear in the dark. But I knew I wasn't done. Whatever had happened to James Wright, whatever had been watching from the tunnels, was still here. And now I knew I had seen too much. I grabbed my phone, fingers shaking, and dialed Mr. Hill. The call rang once. Twice. Then, nothing but a long, empty static. My stomach twisted as I pulled the phone away, staring at the screen. No service. That didn't make sense. I had been able to call him before. I tried again. Same thing. It was as if something had cut me off, severing the connection, forcing me to make a choice. I took a deep breath, got out of the car, and walked back inside the school. The hallways were different now, as if the building itself had shifted in my absence. The air felt thicker, the shadows heavier. The silence wasn't just empty, it was waiting. My footsteps echoed too loud, bouncing off the walls as I moved toward the boiler room. I should have turned back. I should have walked away. But I didn't. The tunnel door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it before. I remembered the weight of the key in my hand, the way the lock had clicked into place. But now, it hung slightly open, revealing the yawning darkness beyond. The air that seeped from the gap was cold and damp, smelling of old stone and something else. Something metallic. Something wet. I swallowed hard, gripped my flashlight, and stepped inside. The tunnel was silent, but not in a way that made me feel alone. The further I moved, the more I felt it, the presence, pressing against me, surrounding me, unseen but undeniable. The old maintenance doors passed by in my peripheral vision, the flickering light bulbs overhead humming like dying insects. Then I heard it. A single, soft footstep behind me. I froze. Another step. Slow. Measured. Not mine. My breath caught in my throat, my pulse hammering against my ribs as I forced myself to turn. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty corridor behind me. Nothing was there. But the dust on the floor was disturbed. Footprints. Not mine. I backed up, keeping my light fixed ahead, refusing to blink. Something had followed me in here. Something was watching me. I turned, quickening my pace, but with every step I took, the tunnel seemed to stretch longer, as if the exit was being pulled further away. My flashlight flickered. And then, a voice. Not a whisper this time. Right behind me. You see now. I spun, heart slamming against my ribs, and for the briefest second, my flashlight landed on a shape. Tall. Thin. Its arms too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The features were blurred, like something out of focus, shifting, vibrating with something wrong. Its eyes, if they were eyes at all, were black, empty, hungry. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I ran. I sprinted toward the boiler room, my breath ragged, the walls pressing in, the air thick and suffocating. My flashlight died completely, plunging me into total darkness. My hand slammed against the door at the end of the tunnel, fingers scrambling for the handle. It wouldn't move. Something cold brushed against the back of my neck. A whisper, curling into my ear like a breath from a place where nothing should be breathing. You let him out. The door ripped open, and I tumbled forward into the boiler room, gasping as the air turned warm again. The light overhead flickered once, twice, before steadying. My flashlight flickered back on. I turned. The tunnel was empty. The door stood wide open, but there was nothing there. No footsteps. No shadow. But I knew. It was out. I locked the door. I backed away. I left the school without looking back, my breath still coming in ragged, uneven bursts. I didn't go back. I didn't quit, I just stopped showing up. The school called, left messages, even threatened to withhold my final paycheck. I didn't care. Whatever I had seen, whatever I had released, was not my problem anymore. But that wasn't the end. A week later, Central High made the news. A student had gone missing. She had stayed late for practice, left the gym alone, but never made it to her car. Security cameras glitched the moment she walked past the boiler room hallway. No footage of her leaving the building. No trace of her found. Another name swallowed by the tunnels. I turned off the TV. I knew exactly where she was. And this time, I wasn't going back to save her.